The Newman Center is home to the Catholic community at GW. We host various events throughout the semester, including retreats, social events, and student masses to allow students to explore and learn more about the Catholic faith, to deepen their own faith, and to share it with others. All GW students, no matter your faith background, are welcome at the Newman Center. We'd love for you to join us on Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. when we host a free and delicious home-cooked meal for all students. As I mentioned before, we are excited to be presenting this event in association with the Center for Inquiry DC. I would now like to introduce the Executive Director of the Center, Ms. Melody Hensley, to say a few words.
Thanks for the introduction, Cara. If this is your first time at a Center for Inquiry event, our mission is to foster a secular society based on science, reason, freedom of inquiry, and humanist values. We're very pleased to be co-sponsoring this event with the Newman Center and GW Catholics. If you'd like to learn more about the Center for Inquiry DC, we have an information table out front. We are one of the biggest and most active communities for atheists, agnostic skeptics, humanists, etc., in the Washington area and in the United States. So please sign up to receive information about our upcoming event. Thank you and enjoy the debate.
Thank you, Melody. It is now my pleasure to introduce our debaters. Representing the theist perspective this evening is Father Carter Griffin, a Roman Catholic priest from the Archdiocese of Washington. A graduate of Princeton University, he served 4 years in the United States Navy. His seminary studies include 2 years of philosophy at Mount St. Mary's Seminary, followed by 5 years of theology at the Pontifical North American College in Rome. Upon his ordination in 2004, he served as the priest secretary to the Archbishop of Washington before completing a doctorate in moral theology. He currently serves as the director of priestly vocations of the Archdiocese of Washington and is vice rector of the new Blessed John Paul II Seminary. Representing the atheist perspective is Dr. John Shook. Dr. Shook is director of education and senior research fellow at the Center for Inquiry. He received his doctorate in philosophy from the University of Buffalo, where he currently serves as visiting assistant professor of science education and research associate in philosophy. He has authored and edited more than a dozen books, serves as a co-editor for 3 philosophy journals, and travels for lectures across the U.S. and around the world. His latest book is entitled The God Debates, a 21st Century Guide for Atheists and Believers, and everyone in between. I'd now like to turn things over to our moderator for this evening, Tim Miller, the Associate Dean of Students in the Center for Student Engagement.
Good evening, and on behalf of the George Washington University, I'd like to welcome our 2 panelists, as well as everyone who's assembled here this evening, so we can host a discussion brought to you by the Newman Catholic Student Center and the Center for Inquiry. As an academic institution, we believe that the core of academic learning lives in discourse and debate. We look forward to a lively discussion this evening. We will ask that everyone respect all those in attendance this evening and the nature of this event by not interrupting either speaker with applause or any other way throughout. Anyone who is deemed to be disruptive, we will have to ask you to leave the event and we'll have you escorted out. We do expect this to be a civil discourse, and that's what we expect of everyone here tonight. The format will feature opening statements by both panelists, followed by a reply by each, and then closing statements. We'll then take questions from the audience. The way the Q&A will work is that paper and pens were distributed as people came in, as you entered the ballroom, and there will also be people on the outside aisles with extras as well as more pens. They'll be collected starting after both openings by people in the aisles. And as you write questions, please note they should be directed to a specific member of the panel, and then I'll alternate questions between the debaters. The last call for questions will occur after the second reply. So that'll be the 4th time that someone speaks. So we'll do one last call at that point for questions, so you will have quite a while still to write your questions. So with that, we'll go ahead and open, and we will ask that Father Griffin will make the first statement.
Thanks very much, Tim. And thanks to the George Washington Newman Center for having me here, and in a particular way, the Center for Inquiry. It's a great honor for me to be here, and I'm sort of humbled. I'm not sure I'm the best representative of the theist position. Turns out I'm the only guy who would come for free, so that's why I'm here. But in all honesty, there's a great temptation as I sort of reflected upon what I wanted to try to say as an opening statement about the existence of God. And the great temptation is to launch straight into all the arguments, just start launching, And it occurred to me, though, I'm certainly no expert on these debates. I've seen one or two. And one thing that strikes me is that I think very often the two sides never really get at some of the underlying assumptions on both sides, and therefore never really engage the issue at its deepest level. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time this evening presenting how I believe that we can come to a knowledge about the existence of God in a way that is intellectually rigorous and reasonable. So I intend to do sort of two things. I hope to demonstrate that there are good and solid, rational reasons for believing that God exists, that it's more likely that he exists than he doesn't. I'm firmly convinced that the power of reason, unclouded by any prejudice, can come to know that God exists. And while I realize it's not a decisive argument in itself, the very fact that virtually every culture in history, that really numerically virtually every person in history has believed in God is not irrelevant. And the question becomes why? Why is that the case? And I hope to explore that today. The other thing is, and the second part of this, is to give some reasons why I believe that the Christian narrative of God is credible and convincing. I realize that this goes, in a sense, beyond the immediacy of the question, does God exist? But I sort of feel that it's more satisfying, more interesting, and frankly more natural to me as a Catholic priest. I think they go hand in hand. And anyway, if somebody were to agree to the second, then implicitly they agree to the first. If Jesus Christ is the Son of God, then clearly God does exist. I think more importantly, though, it helps to frame the debate as I see it. That the question about God existing is not simply a question about whether Christ is known to be, but whether he is known. And ultimately, that intellectual question cannot be separated totally, cannot be removed from coming to know him as a person. And so therefore, I think the two, in a sense, do go hand in hand in the way that I'd like to frame the debate today. I find it ironic that as a Catholic priest, as a celibate man, very often I am asked to be the matchmaker. I find that ironic. I'm very bad at it, incidentally. But very often I know young people who are interested in meeting somebody else, young man or young woman, and in that discussion, if there's somebody that I sort of feel they would get to, enjoy getting to know, I have to convince them enough for them to get to know each other. I can say where they're from, what they're like, why I think they'll get along. I can encourage them. At the end, I cannot force them to meet, and I certainly cannot force them to fall in love, nor would I try. And getting to know the Lord is similar to that. It's an intellectual process, to be sure, certainly to get the process started, but it can never ignore the order of love and beauty and goodness. And so the variety of arguments that I'd like to present in very summary form in the course of particularly this opening statement, but throughout the evening, those variety of arguments, it's not a question of obstructionism or throwing up sand or just trying to get something over there that'll actually make it across to the other side. It's a question of opening more and more windows, just as if I were explaining and describing someone to you that I really felt that you'd love to get to know. It's like discovering more and more clues about a mystery. One clue may not be sufficient to have case closed, but a lot of clues add up cumulatively to a solved case. So how can we come to know if God exists? Well, I think that science and reason are two extraordinarily powerful ways of coming to know reality. They tell us so much about the world and its wonders. In fact, I would argue historically, this It's not really the purpose of the debate, but I would argue that it actually emerged from a Christian worldview, a Judeo-Christian worldview, because precisely the Judeo-Christian approach to the cosmos was that it's not simply a cluster of impenetrable divine myths, that it came from the mind of a creator, that it came from the mind of someone who gave it order and structure and reason, that we've been given a mind to use and an ordered universe to use it on. This is more rare in the history of humanity than we may think. And Christian civilization therefore founded the very notion of a university in Bologna and Paris, Oxford and elsewhere, and has been a great defender of critical thought, the very critical thought that we are trying to use this evening, both of us. And so science and reason and faith, if there's one thing that I would ask you to take away this evening is this, are never legitimately in conflict. If there appears to be a conflict between science, reason, and faith, then either our theology is wrong, or our science is wrong, or both. But there is never a legitimate conflict because truth ultimately is only one. Having said that, science and reason are limited. There are some things like friendship and honor, curiosity, intuition, all kinds of great intangible goods that we all value very much that cannot be understood by science and reason alone. The lover struggles to express himself in poetry and in art because he knows that the cold hand of logic is not enough. The scientist fares no better, in a sense, in evaluating love. Is love countable, observable? Is it measurable? Is it repeatable? Can we weigh it? Can we even predict it? And if this is all true of love, then I suggest that it's even more true of God. And so in order to answer the question about the existence of God, we need to open a greater breadth of knowledge. And this is really the common sense approach to knowledge that we all have. We do, in fact, know and come to know through means other than a narrow vision of reason, science, and experience. We should be guided and checked always by the rules of good reasoning, by logic, but we cannot trust only to our senses, but also to our minds and our hearts in the fullest sense, and to experience in the fullest sense, and see if there are convincing and compelling and converging arguments for the existence of God. So I'd like to group these arguments under three main headings. And again, the purpose is simply to kind of skip the tops of the mountains here. And in the course perhaps of the evening, those which are most interesting to Dr. Shook and to you, we'll be able to explore in a little bit more detail. But the arguments of science essentially means that the created order points to God. The created order points to a creator. That order presents and suggests an orderer. In a way, these are the ones that sort of get the most coverage, in a lot of these debates, and they're very important. I think they're interesting, but frankly, I think they can sometimes be a little bit superficial, because the notion of God that they can point to is a fairly thin notion of God. It needs to go a little bit deeper than that. But nonetheless, contemporary science, the so-called first efficient cause argument, contemporary science very clearly seems to be pointing to a temporal beginning of the universe, the so-called Big Bang, which incidentally was originated in the thought of a Catholic priest, Georges Lemaitre. And this would strongly favor a belief in God, since it would mean that there was a beginning of the universe, and that in turn suggests a first cause, a creator, not an infinitely regressive series of causes. In a sense, underlying that is the metaphysical first cause argument. The ancient maxim from Persius, de nihilo nihil, nothing comes from nothing. And even if, hypothetically, in the future, the Big Bang theory were to be disproved, or somebody were to posit, I believe without really any evidence right now, a layered universe model or multiverse, or even an infinite number of universes, what have you, at the end, there would still need to be a metaphysical beginning. There would need to be a metaphysical cause of that multiverse. It would still need to satisfy the principle of sufficient reason. C.S. Lewis, when he became a Christian from being an atheist, he said that he felt in his bones that the universe does not cause itself. Related to this as well is the so-called fine-tuning argument. Again, makes a lot of pay in the course of a lot of these debates. So basically, it's the delicate balance of natural laws and physical constants that allow organic life as we know it. The Big Bang was 15 or 20 billion years ago. If you were to change the temperature of that explosion by a trillionth of a degree, colder or hotter, the carbon atom could never have been created. And therefore, life as we know it could not have existed. And finally, maybe the most simple, most intuitive, most direct of all, is essentially the order of beauty, the order itself of the universe. It's incredibly straightforward, and I think without, honestly, any preconceived objections, it's something that simply makes sense. That design means that there's a designer. If you see a painting, then you know there's a painter. If you hear a symphony, then you know that there's a composer. It takes a very clever person, I think, to turn this very basic intuition into something questionable and complicated. The very order that we are using to engage in this debate, the order of our minds, our thoughts, the laws of logic, all suggest that order is not just there, hanging in limbo with no metaphysical origin or purpose. The second sort of area, second kind of arguments that we can point to are the arguments of human creativity, really the arguments of human reason in general. That reason is not simply, although it is certainly, the application of the laws of logic and good reasoning, but that there is a whole breadth of the human experience of knowing and coming to know. And the first of these is creativity. We may have heard the factoid I once heard. You know, you put a monkey at a typewriter, it's going to take him more years than there are molecules in the universe to type the first paragraph of Hamlet. Right? Whatever. Right? But the point is that the creativity that goes into one paragraph of Hamlet is something that simply cannot be reduced to chance or simply to kind of the pattern or ordering of molecules or what have you. That there is something in creativity which suggests and reflects the divine. There is something that simply cannot be accounted for in the novelty, the power, the explosiveness of human creativity. It's something that points to an original creator. A second argument from sort of human reason writ large is a deep desire that we have in our own hearts, a desire for joy, a desire for eternity. As Nietzsche himself said, who is no friend of theism, he said, all joy wills eternity, wills deep, deep eternity, he said. There may be no way to fulfill it, I grant, but it would be unusual. It would be extraordinary. It would be the only desire that ultimately could not be fulfilled. I mean, it would be, I think it was C.S. Lewis who gave the example of going to a planet and meeting creatures who are made out of rock who are hungry. Makes no sense, right? If there's hunger, then it can be satisfied. If there's thirst, it can be slaked. And if there's a desire for eternal life, then it at least suggests that there's the capacity to fulfill it. And finally, under the realm of human reason, is essentially the religious intuition that we all have. Only human beings have religious intuitions of any sort. Never in history has a monkey crafted tools, or used abstract language, or knelt in prayer. Only human beings go to work, they go to art galleries, and they go to church. Religion is something that we do as rational beings. And believing in the transcendent is an eminently rational thing to do. One such desire that we all, I think, share is a desire to give thanks. And Peter Kraft gave a beautiful example in which he asked the question, what does the atheist do with the sea? So what a terrible moment that must be for an atheist, he writes, when he feels great gratitude for the gift of the sea and there is no one to thank for it. For most of us, the terrible moments in life are the moments of grief, when hope is tested. For an atheist, I think the most terrible moments must be the moments of joy, when there arises from his heart the wisest and best feeling that anyone can have, cosmic gratitude, and it's judged a temptation to be religious. Imagine how horrible it must be to feel that gratitude is a temptation. And finally, the arguments from human experience, again, sort of writ large. One of these is the very complicated, difficult argument about suffering and evil. I think suffering and evil are so often drawn out and used against the theistic point of view, and I think it's a mistake. I think, in fact, that mysterious and awful as they are, suffering and evil point very clearly to the transcendent. We all rebel against evil, against suffering. We all cry out, "It should not be." And the point is, we're right. It should not be. But that should is a metaphysical statement. It points to something outside the world, something that ought to be. Evil is simply the lack of goodness. So evil always points, whether it wants to or not, to the good. Rebelling against evil, then, is the beginning of faith. There is something wrong, and we know it, and we need help, and that help can only come from God. And that's when we begin to reach out to him. That's the beginning of good theology. The second area of human experience to point out is the area of morality. I do think, and this is sort of in two sort of parts, I do think that it is essentially impossible to, and perhaps many atheists would agree with this, to ground any absolute moral norms without a transcendent lawgiver. That such and such is wrong always and everywhere, no matter what time, no matter what place, no matter what circumstances. And if morality is not rooted in a source beyond us, then at some level it is subject to individual or societal qualifications, determination of what is evil and what isn't. Every norm could always have exceptions. We could always cook up some extreme circumstance to justify evil behavior. It's very difficult, I think perhaps impossible, outside of a belief in God, to state categorically that it is never permissible to murder or to rape or to torture, no matter what is at stake, no matter what. And the second part of this discussion of morality is about conscience. If we look within ourselves, every one of us, we see an arbiter of right and wrong, of good and evil. Everyone has a conscience. And I think probably all of us agree that we should follow our conscience. But a judge judges laws, and laws mean a lawgiver, and this is God. Basically, everyone knows deep down that they should do good and be good, and such a determination, I believe, can only come from God. A third area of human experience, and this may sound surprising, but it's miracles. I realize that miracles do not produce faith, and they don't even convince an unbeliever that God exists. The old adage, for those who do believe, miracles are not necessary. For those who don't believe, miracles are not sufficient. And yet for the seeker, for the person searching for truth, I believe miracles can provide a very powerful motive of credibility. You know, if I were an atheist, first thing I would do is jump on a plane, go to Naples, and see if that blood of St. Januarius really does turn to liquid every day, every year, inexplicably. I'd go to Lourdes and look at the 70 or more documented medical miracles that scientists have been totally baffled by. I'd go to Portugal to read the interviews of 70,000 people who saw the miracle of the sun. In Mexico City, to see a tilma that should have decayed 400 years ago. I'd go to Siena to see consecrated hosts that are 300 years old and are as fresh as the day that they were baked. Miracles do not produce faith, but they can certainly foster it. And finally, I'd like to point out the witness of the saints. You know, G.K. Chesterton had this great quote. He said, you know, the only unanswerable argument against Christianity is Christians. And he's right. But the only unanswerable argument for Christianity are the saints. That God is a spiritual reality, and he cannot be seen with the eyes of our body. But he can be seen in his effects, and especially the effects of a person who's been transformed by his grace. That some are simply perhaps not able to be convinced, for whatever reason, by the straightforward witness of science and reason and our experience that God exists. But I've found in these cases that the argument of sanctity is often the most powerful of all. I hope that everyone here knows at least one person who is a saintly person, a truly good person, and who possesses a strength, a beauty, an authenticity, a goodness that is tremendously compelling. And it's my very earnest hope that each of you will experience this and experience one day their great witness to the existence and the goodness of God. And so each of these ways of knowing, through science, through reason, and through experience, point in these and many other ways to the existence of God in a manner that is clear, compelling, and converging and convincing. And the conclusion, I believe, is that it is far more rational, more reasonable, more consistent with human experience and history to hold that God exists. Thank you very much.
And before I ask Dr. Shook to start, just because we had one, if we could all take a second and please put our phones on either mute or vibrate, please. We'll wait a moment for that to happen, including our panelists.
Well, good evening, and thank you for coming out tonight. We're both delighted that you all came, and it's marvelous that George Washington University and the Newman Center was able to host this event, and of course CFI DC is delighted to be here, and I especially thank my very able opponent, as you just saw, very able indeed. I'm an atheist. Well, I guess you knew that. If you happen to be religious, I don't believe in your God, but don't feel singled out, since I don't believe in any of the hundreds of other gods worshipped by people around the world either. We have a lot in common. You don't think those people have good reasons to believe in those other gods. I mean, I don't think so either. They keep on believing their religions anyways, we suppose, in conformity to their upbringing and their culture. We can agree that faithful conformity explains why there are still so many religions, like yours and all the others. And we can see how mere faith can't figure out which religion is right, if any of them are. You're therefore a wise non-believer in all those other gods, just like me. I simply believe in one less God than you do, but for basically the same reasons. There's not such a big difference between us after all, I think. Now, perhaps you can start to appreciate where I'm coming from, since we're all much more impressed by people taking responsibility for good thinking than mere conformity. I hope you can respect me for taking this important responsibility seriously. I'm not an atheist because I feel angry about God or because I've made some willfully blind choice against religion. I'm holding myself to the same standard and same responsibility I hold you to, everyone to. We should all base our beliefs on the best reasons available. And as Father Griffin has said, there can be many reasons out there to consider, and we have to look at all of them fairly. Atheists are happy to take responsibility for their minds and their lives, just like you do. And perhaps we can all wish that we would live in a world where more people took that same responsibility. We imagine a world to come in which everyone could respectfully debate the good reasons for and against the beliefs in all those gods, whichever God anyone wants to bring up. Now, the fact, however, that most people have believed in some god or another, again, as Father Griffin pointed out, is actually not really good evidence that any one God exists. It's more just a sign of a failure of many, many people throughout centuries and millennia to be fully rational. I say let debate decide, not just some sort of mass vote. So my job is to explain why I doubt that a God exists. I should start by saying what kind of atheist I am specifically. I'm a skeptical atheist. I say this because I think there's no God, because available evidence doesn't support any God. Now, I'm happy to admit that there's vast mystery out there beyond human knowledge, but mystery cannot equal God. We're not pointing at God just simply by pointing at mystery. A mystery remains a mystery, no matter what you happen to like to label it, and no one can know anything about it by definition, not even religious people. Not the other sort of atheist, perhaps you've heard of this sort of atheist, an atheist who knows way more than I do, who thinks that it can be proven that God can't exist, and who says that all mystery will be solved by science eventually. I'm not like that. I'm a skeptical atheist, not a know-it-all atheist, maybe. If my opponent were happen to complain that I can't prove God doesn't exist or science doesn't have explanations for everything, he's arguing against some other atheists, not against me. So let's look at the evidence, and we need some rules of the road, as Father Griffin has pointed out. We need, how did he put it, some underlying assumptions of reason. I have a handful of suggestions, 3 simple rules about neutrality, modesty, and mystery. The first one is neutrality. If you're going to try to persuade other people who aren't of your same religion or of no religion, only rely on good evidence and ordinary reasoning available to everyone. Both religion and atheism can appeal to things everybody has access to: logical reasoning, public evidence, good science. If your religion is instead relying on some special revelation or miraculous event only believed in by the faithful, then you're going in logical circles. You can't prove that you really know anything. The second rule is about modesty. Don't be impressed by theories able to explain, quote, all the evidence. God made it that way for any possible thing that comes up, from why birds have wings or why there's a sky. We need to be able to have theories that actually do reasonable explanations, not theories that can just easily explain everything. A simple rule of thumb is a theory that can easily explain everything actually explains nothing. The third rule I'm going to offer is a rule that I'll call the rule of mystery. It's actually sort of the counterpart of the principle of sufficient reason that was already mentioned. Don't accept an explanation when it actually only increases mystery. Real explanations decrease mystery, to some degree at least, not increase it. For example, you're going to hear me talk about why I think that offering up a God to explain the universe isn't even an explanation, much less a bad one, because it only arouses more questions, unanswerable questions, and hence arouses more mystery. Science, by the way, not religion, discovered that nature has orderly laws. Let me mention that. It was, of course, astronomers that first discovered that the heavenly bodies, right? Heavenly. Well, to the Babylonians, they were mysteries, and they might have called them gods, but they discovered that the gods obey mathematical laws. Not that gods created the mathematical laws in the first place. It only took later religious confusion to turn that around. Science comes first. Religion and theology has always been following science's advances ever since. This is true also of the Big Bang. Religions all say they're the only ones that can explain why any nature exists at all. They say science can't do this. But of course, even if science itself can't explain where it all came from, that doesn't mean that religion can offer God as a genuine explanation for itself, that we're suddenly forced to buy. You know, like there's a harsh dichotomy. If science can't explain it, then we've got to go running to the nearest scripture. First, for all we know, it may actually be endless more nature. Friar Griffin wasn't impressed with this metaphysical option, but he can't prove it otherwise. He doesn't want to believe that metaphysically some larger, wider nature out there beyond the Big Bang, perhaps consisting in some form of ultimate quantum reality or an infinite number of other universes, is behind our own Big Bang. He's looking for a first cause. There may be, despite simplistic logical arguments, no first cause, ultimately. There may be a cause. There probably is a cause of our Big Bang, and cosmology is working on that, and cosmology will tell a story of what came before, prior, behind the Big Bang, whatever the story may be. Science respects the principle of sufficient reason. It's the engine of science, too. That is the one and only thing that science and religion have in common. But science takes the principle of sufficient reason far more seriously because it offers explanations that actually connect in some way with the thing to be explained. Think about it, trying to imagine how a supernatural God could create physical nature when those two things, by definition, don't have hardly anything, if anything, in common, only creates more mysteries, not knowledge. Offering God as an explanation for the universe just creates more mysteries, since no one could have any concrete idea how a supernatural, non-physical God could make a physical universe from nothing. Remember that? Talk about a violation of the principle of sufficient reason. From nothing. In a real explanation, again, the cause has something in common with the effect. That's what science obeys. So that there's a way to connect those two things and decrease mystery, not increase it. If you just say, well, my God can do anything, actually you're just simply admitting that you're utterly mystified by such an act of creation. And indeed, honest theologians will tell you, yeah, it's another one of those mysteries. You just got to buy into it if you're going to be religious like us. All right. The fine-tuning argument was mentioned. Atheists do have to deal with the fine-tuning argument, so I have a bit of words prepared about that. Of course, the theologian thinks that the universe is specially designed to have the natural laws that it does. Interesting how the theologian, again, has to come running to science for understandings of those current scientific facts about the universe, such as we know it. It does look like there's an interesting, delicate arrangement of some basic laws of nature. However, unlike religion, science revises its theories in light of new evidence. This means that these fine-tuning sorts of arguments are precariously based on current scientific knowledge that will probably change in the future. Our current knowledge of the laws of nature involved with the Big Bang are scarcely older than 100 years old. Some of the earliest ones dealing with special relativity and general relativity and so forth. Calculations about how probable our universe's laws really are highly speculative. They're going to eventually have to be revised. Theology puts itself in a very precarious position. Besides, the fine-tuning of the universe for life is way overblown. If you look at the typical list of things that have to turn out just right, most of those things involve kind of tricky picks of units of measurement that aren't really fair. There are a few basic constants that are necessary for the evolution of galaxies, stars, and planets, but it turns out with some recent calculations, and I can give you citations afterwards if you're interested in these, you could vary the strengths of basic forces and masses of subatomic particles by as much as 15 to 20% and still have a very good chance for life to evolve just fine in the universe. But let's talk about the evolution of life in the universe. What is the evidence? What has science, not theology by the way, but what has science discovered about the real nature of this universe that we live in? Did God do it? Well, if God did it, it's a fairly odd universe. If God loves life so much, our universe can't be used as evidence that a God cares much about us in particular or about life in general. Our universe is not a pleasant place for life. 99.9999999% of it is near absolute vacuum at 3 degrees above absolute zero, traveled intermittently only by photons. There's never going to be any life out there. Our universe isn't even going to be livable in the long run, as expansion and entropy gradually eliminates all the heat sources in the long run. It's very easy to imagine a more hospitable universe for life, if that's what it was designed for. But I doubt it. The God hypothesis fails to explain our actual universe. The better hypothesis that does fit the evidence that we have is that life has haphazardly emerged and evolved in a few favorable climates, planets here and there, and it precariously clings to survival against a nature that just doesn't care. This is the big problem of natural evil, as was mentioned. It's not the little problem of human evil, why humans do bad things to each other. The big problem of natural evil is a very old problem for God, any God. Theology would love to prove that a perfect God made this world, but then a theologian has to defend everything about the universe as something that God wants. We heard very eloquent words about suffering. I don't like it, and this universe causes way too much of it. Is God not powerful or smart enough to prevent so many evils? Are all of them absolutely necessary in this perfect design? The theologian must magically convert every single natural evil into something good in order to fully protect God's reputation. One unexplained evil demolishes the God hypothesis. What about a horrible disease that strikes thousands of children, causing immense suffering and premature death? I'm not saying there can't be any diseases. Is every single disease necessary? Is every single disease necessarily a good thing? According to the theologian, yes. I'm worried about religious people really wanting to think that every evil is actually something either good or that can be turned to good. I think that is a path to madness. Not every evil can be justified or turned into good, not even by a God. Religion has always prided itself on telling the hard difference between good and evil. If religion is about the business of converting every evil into something that can look good enough, religion then can't even really explain evil anymore. In fact, it can't even tell the difference between good and evil anymore, which I thought was rather one of the points of pride of religion. The atheist, by the way, has no difficulty perceiving the universe as it really is, with all of its defects. We feel the suffering just as much as anyone, even if we cannot turn it into something good, and we are still able to tell the difference between good and evil. So let's talk about good and evil. Let's talk about morality. There's a common theological argument out there that says only a great God can account for how humans can know these objective or absolute moral truths. Are there absolute moral truths that someone like myself can't know and can't explain? This sort of theological argument can't ever really work. Of course, the theologian tries to claim that people in the right religion, perhaps Father Griffin's religion, can certainly know what morality really is, but of course that violates the rule of neutrality that I mentioned earlier. He's already begging the question that he already knows how a God exists in order to establish that morality. Is there a non-question begging way? Well, let him tell us what this objective morality is. He doesn't happen to do that, and I know why. It's because religions have always intensely disagreed with each other and even amongst each other of the same religion about what these allegedly absolute moral truths are. Religions, like every other cultural institution, evolve and change. This actually is a sign of intelligence, but to cling to absolute moral truths is not a sign of intelligence. It's a sign of stubbornness. I have just as strong a conscience as anyone. I don't need any judge or lawgiver to tell me morality. I defy Father Griffin to tell me I don't know morality. I know lots of moral truths. Here's one: do unto others as you would have to do unto them, as you would have them do unto you, which is, by the way, found in many of the world's religions. Is that a sign that it's good, solid human wisdom? Yes. Is that a sign that a God told everybody the same thing? No. If you want shining examples of moral drift and moral change, look at religions, which are excellent examples of dramatic change. It must be a great embarrassment for religious people, even of the same religion, every time they divide over some great moral issue of the day: slavery, abortion, euthanasia, civil rights for homosexuals. Where is this absolute morality? I know they earnestly want to believe what it is. Atheists already know. Let me wrap up with a few concluding words. Father Griffin talked about how knowing God is more like getting into a relationship. Intellect can get us into a relationship with reality, but it is the case that religion is as much an emotional matter, and atheists have to acknowledge that. When religion resorts to personal emotion, I just want you to realize, step back for a minute, it's powerful stuff, but this sort of argument is actually a humanistic, and it's a pragmatic argument for faith. Religion is good for you. Well, maybe, maybe not, but look at that premise. You're supposed to be religious because it's good for you. That makes, by the way, humans the standard and judge of morality, not a God or not an ancient scripture. And indeed, I regard it as an excellent thing that many of the world's advanced religions are indeed becoming more humanistic and more pragmatic, if not rapidly secular in many ways. Religion is good for you. Well, maybe it is, and maybe it isn't. But I'm more comfortable living in a world where humans put themselves first and set themselves as the judges of what is good for them than trusting in any transcendent source, so mysterious a source. Yes, human beings are creative, imaginative, rational. We can live joyous lives. This is a wonderful thing to be proud of ourselves about humanity. But I claim that evolution can explain how we've come to have these brains and these capacities. I haven't heard any denial, any rejection of evolution. Perhaps we will hear one. I also claim that atheists can live joyous lives just as good without religion. We heard some words about saints, and religions have offered to the world, all around the world, wonderful shining examples of prophets and moral leaders and ethical seers who can see where humanity needs to go. These are good things for humanity. I would not deny the value of religious saints in the past. What I deny is that we have to continue to need them into the future. And what exactly made those religious saints possible? First of all, they very often tended to be freethinkers and dissenters and people exceedingly unhappy with too much conformity going on around. They were not content with Scripture. They were not content with the judges and the lawmakers around them. They used their brains and their creativity and their imagination that evolution gave them to imagine a better future for humanity for your own good. I applaud that. I deny that God is involved in it, but I do applaud that. I think in the future, secular saints need to work alongside these religious saints. Perhaps humanity needs a combination of both, but let it be understood, the atheist position is, there are no divine miracles at work here. There's no spiritual illumination coming from some transcendent beyond. Ultimately, it's human beings that should be proud to take responsibility for our shared future together, and the atheist is no less proud to participate in that than any religious person. Thank you very much.
Father Griffin, your reply?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Dr. Shook, for those thoughtful words. I want to just continue maybe a little bit part of the discussion, the underlying issues, the underlying assumptions on both sides, and suggest that while probably neither of us will have a chance to address every argument preferred by the other, we'll certainly try to in the course of the whole 2 hours, but sort of to say, what are some of the assumptions that are actually guiding some of these responses? And I would suggest, well, Dr. Shook is a professed naturalist, believes that we can know through reason, science, and experience, I believe. Is that correct?
Sounds familiar, like something I might have said.
And I wouldn't presume to know perhaps exactly how he means each of those words, but I would suggest that if they are meant to narrowly, then they simply are insufficient to explain the kind of knowledge that we are all capable of having. All of us are capable of having. I'm not speaking about a particular segment of society or kind of some Gnostics. I've relied only on evidence that anyone and everyone can come to know. But to take an example, if reasonable is equated with only what can be known by reason, I think that's a problem. I mean, after all, there are many things that are reasonable that can't be totally comprehended by our minds. There's a part of a person, for example, that is always mysterious, part of a person that is always impenetrable, inaccessible to my reason alone. And yet my love for my dearest friend is not unreasonable. It's reasonable, and yet it goes beyond the confines of reason alone. So when we say that we want to have evidence that is reasonable, we're not talking about something that can only fit within the confines of reason itself. That our reason can point to that which is beyond it. To take another example, science. If science means the reduction, and again, I'm not presuming, this is Dr. Shook's point of view, but if science means the reduction of all knowledge to scientific knowledge, the idea that if science can't measure it, it's not real, that's not real science. That's scientism. It's a kind of religious faith. In fact, it's a blind faith, I think. If by experience we rule out simply from the beginning, a priori, certain kinds of experience, human experience, deep and universal human yearnings, the teleology of the human narrative, that I have a purpose, and that things have a purpose, and religious experience itself, then it's ruling out some very important types of human experience, and hence knowledge. This is not sentimentalism. I'm not claiming that religious feelings are the proof for the existence of God, or that they're miracles that only a few people in the Sanctum Sanctorum actually know about and no one else can see. I'm talking about things wide open for the whole world to look at and judge and examine for themselves. In fact, I would argue that the very claim, if they are understood narrowly, that all knowledge comes from science, reason, and experience, falls on itself. Because in itself, it can't defend the fact that all knowledge comes from reason, science, and experience. It's a self-referential argument. It's philosophically unsound, if those terms are taken in their narrow sense. It defines reality in such a way that it is impossible to rationally articulate the existence of anything outside itself. It rules out God from the start by making him impossible to exist. As I think Dr. Shook has written elsewhere about bad theology, and rightfully so, making a theory that can't be proven false doesn't make it true. And it may be that at least some versions of naturalism, and I would argue that at least from the evidence from that opening statement of Dr. Shook, that at least to some extent, this is the case, that God has been defined out from the beginning. And so science, reason, and experience, in the ways that I've attempted to use them, in a more fuller sense, in a broader sense, do provide us with many solid signposts, clues to the transcendent, windows into the reality and love of God. I'd like to take a few moments to point out, again, we won't be able to do all of them, but some of the principal points that Dr. Shook made so eloquently. The first is that theology has somehow depended upon science when theologians, for example, bring forward the Big Bang Theory. I mean, it's sort of, the whole thing is kind of turned on its head. In fact, the Big Bang Theory is simply something that's being pulled into from the realm of science to say, hey, look, the things that theology is pointing to actually have, a lot of evidence outside of the narrow confines of theology itself. That theology is not designed in order to explain the natural world. And I'm afraid that sometimes atheists look at theology and they say, look how poorly the Bible explains the natural world, as if that's the purpose of the Bible. Right? I'm certainly not saying that there's any conflict, that the Bible would never be read in such a way, for example, that conflicts with the realities of science, reason, and experience. But that's not what it's there for. It's there to be a revelation about God. It's not designed to tell us about the Big Bang Theory or about a multiverse or about anything else. And so I think it's important that we remember that my faith in God is credible because of clear and converging evidence. Lots of different kinds of evidence. And sometimes I think others can tax theology because of its unreliability as they see it in the scientific understanding of the world. That's not what it's there for. So what came before the Big Bang? Or can we just say that science will one day see that, that this is just kind of the reigning fad in a sense, that this too will be surpassed? Well, I think there are a couple of difficulties there. First of all, it's pure hypothesis, right? It's a hypothetical future, about a hypothetical science, about a hypothetical conclusions that demolish our argument for God. And therefore we must conclude that God doesn't exist. So I think that there's the hypothetical nature of it is one check on that argument about the Big Bang. But the other thing, and more importantly, that if science is so unreliable, if everything we know by science is going to be changing down the road, then where's the reliability, where's the consistency, where's the dependability about anything that the naturalist claims? No, I actually think that science is far more reliable because it doesn't depend, the existence and the truth about the beginning of the universe doesn't depend upon this theory or that theory. We believe that there are good and solid reasons, metaphysically and physically, for believing that the universe had a beginning and ultimately that it had a creator. The fine-tuning argument was also mentioned that 999% is incompatible and unfriendly to life, and that this God is an awfully inefficient God, and that if this whole universe were made for the sake of human beings, then God certainly he's sort of botched the job. I'd say that, first of all, I think just have to say, this is not actually an argument against God. It's just an argument against the kind of God that I would have been, or that Dr. Shook would have been, or that you would have been. It's not an argument against God in itself. But having said that, I will also say that it can kind of work the other way too. That in fact, God maybe isn't sort of the efficient engineer. Maybe he's more the artist. Maybe he's a playful God. Maybe he enjoys the fact that this whole beautiful, wondrous universe was made for these few children that he was going to create on planet Earth in some long-lost galaxy. And that this is part of the wonder of the universe, is that all of this is made for you and me. Does that sound arrogant? Maybe it does. That doesn't make it untrue. Does it sound unrealistic or unlikely? I don't know. I mean, that doesn't make it untrue. I think that in fact, to say that God is done a bad job because he hasn't created the universe that I would have created is not an argument that is really reliable. I would say that to believe in only one less God makes all the difference. That it isn't simply a question of, all these cultures out there believing in all these different kinds of gods, and I simply want to believe in one fewer. In fact, metaphysically, experientially, personally, the difference is vast. Because the theist can say that everyone who has believed in God, which is virtually everyone, has said something that is related to reality, something that is true. Whereas the atheist has to state something far more categorical, that every believer in history has been entirely wrong. And I believe that that is a far more strident and far more difficult argument to make. So in the course of this debate, and we'll have time, I know, for the closing and also the questions to get into some of the other issues, in particular, suffering and evil and morality, which I just don't want to start and then have to stop. But in the course of this debate, I've tried to present some of the signposts that point to the existence of God. I do not believe that in order to be an atheist, you have to do violence to the laws of logic or reason or science, but I do think that it takes far more faith, I would call it blind faith, to be an atheist than to be a theist. For example, an atheist can say that the Big Bang may one day be proven untrue, or that there is no evidence for it, there is an infinite number of universes, a multiverse, or that everything just is and came into being. But these are all simply speculation, and I think far harder to believe than the straightforward facts. Or one can say that human creativity is just a concatenation of molecules, that our desire for eternal life is the only desire that cannot be satisfied, that every religious intuition and expression is false and is delusional. But that's much harder to believe, I think, than the simple evidence before our eyes about human ingenuity and about these deep yearnings and ultimately about religious intuitions that we all share. The answer, I think, is clear. When we look at the cumulative effect of these arguments, it is far more likely than not that God exists. Thank you.
It's funny how fast 10 minutes goes.
Good job. Okay, we're getting there, not much longer. I know you guys are itching with questions already. Good material. Father Griffin only answers a few of my objections. I'll get to those. He first led off with a very kind effort to try to understand my naturalism. He didn't get it quite right, but that's okay. I didn't explain at the outset my naturalism because my skeptical atheism does not rest on proving naturalism true. I believe nature exists. I'll admit it. I hope everyone else believes nature exists at least, right? You got bigger problems if you're not sure about nature than about God. I'd be happy to clarify this business of experience, reason, and science. I don't claim that all knowledge is based on reason alone. You'd have to be some sort of purely logical computer trapped in your own rationalistic deductions. Human beings aren't like that. But what we can do is we can intelligently reason about what we commonly observe in nature. Much of that, if done well and rationally, ends up being called science or engineering or any of the productive technologies and arts. All those things that we call civilization. So my naturalism isn't narrow, it's not reductive. I don't claim that science alone wipes out or ignores human experience. There are some scientists, some philosophers, some atheists who do claim to be quite sure that consciousness is unreal and free will doesn't exist and so forth and so on. And take a philosophy class or two, folks, students, while you can. Those are interesting arguments. My naturalism happens to be of the sort that does not try to replace or eliminate all that rich phenomena of human experience. I would claim, however, that science has proven itself to be the best way to investigate how experiences are connected together and how reality works, and experience fits in that framework, and science can make great progress in understanding why we are the kind of warm-blooded, loving, joyous creatures that we are, but you still got to live it. Science isn't going to live your life for you. But science can be a great guide along the way. That's the naturalist position. What does naturalism have to say about what some of the other things Father Griffin brought up? Scripture, miracle stories, mystical experiences, revelations, God's talking to people. Yeah, no one religion has monopoly on that stuff. All the world's religions get about doing those sorts of things one way or another. Lots of religions have scriptures full of revelations and mystical experiences and stories about revelations and God's doing this and that and the other to human beings. That stuff worked great in the Paleolithic, worked great in Bronze Age, folks. Does that mean it still has to work today? He says it should count as evidence Well, I mean, these experiences do happen to people. Whether or not we should take them to be objectively about something real is a second question. Science has invented the fields of psychology and psychiatry to help explain why people have those kinds of experiences that they do. Even if we were to take them on their face, they, of course, can't say anything objective at all beyond the fact that they happen to people, because, of course, they immediately contradict each other. Even within the same religion, the histories of that religion are replete with great theologians disagreeing with each other over whether that miracle story is valid or whether that revelation is valid, and you have an endless story of people being punished and banished and tortured and killed because they had the wrong revelation. Maybe it was from the devil. Well, maybe. I doubt it. With so much chaos, confusion, and contradiction, nothing objective, nothing that actually resembles anything that could be approved by common sense, much less sound reasoning, can come from that great mass. We understand how religion plays upon people's experiences. Religion is intelligently designed at least to do that much, but nothing more, and certainly nothing more about a God that's so metaphysical. Now, Father Griffin returns to the metaphysical business. He complains that my suggestion that there's more nature behind the Big Bang, even though that's science's job to keep finding out, he complains, he doesn't like it. He complains that, no, it just can't be endless more nature. I haven't proven it. Well, I warned you from the beginning. I'm a skeptical atheist, not a know-it-all atheist. All I have to do is propose one other possible hypothesis that doesn't violate common sense, logic, or science to show that you don't need the God hypothesis. I've done that. I've not heard a rebuttal to that. I've done that. He doesn't like it. I know he doesn't like it. Science hasn't proven it. Who knows what science will come up next? Funny thing about science. Well, you know, science, unlike history, is just not one darn thing after another. Science builds and progresses, not like religions. Religions are apt to come and go and say any next crazy thing the human imagination is apt to come up with. Not science. Science expands the circle of the bright light of human knowledge. It might be a candle in the darkness, but it's not just one candle, it's many candles, and those candles are growing. Fine-tuning. He admits that he can't explain why God made this universe. I rather thought it was the point of theology to explain why God made this universe, not some other universe, not some hypothetical universe. I did complain that a perfect God surely couldn't have made this universe. If Father Griffin doesn't think that his God is perfect, I'd love to hear him admit it. Of course, you know, if you really want to be religious, go with polytheism. Have you ever seen anything designed by committee? The job is to explain this actual universe. He basically admitted that the actual evidence of this universe isn't explained really by his God. I mean, he basically said just about any universe we happen to find himself in, we're supposed to use the God hypothesis. Any universe at all. And he'd say, God did it. Well, yeah, I know. All the religions have been saying that. God did it. All of the evidence. And what did I warn you about being able to so easily explain all the evidence? This is not a rational procedure of intelligence. This is wishful thinking. Let me finish up by talking about this business of blind faith to be an atheist. We are here by the grace of the great blind designer evolution on this planet that with some justice we call Mother Earth, and we should be grateful and respectful to this Mother Earth, and we should be especially respectful and responsible for using our intelligence such as we have it. It's not blind faith to try to use this human intelligence as best we can without letting our wishful thinking or our fantasies or our fears or our nightmares sway us. That's not blind faith, that's courage. And that is the courage of an atheist. We're not the only ones that are that courageous. Many have to look deep into that dark, vast mystery that awaits us all at the end of all things. let's do it fairly and honestly and not scare each other with stories along the way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The issue at hand, I think, is whether I've been able to provide any clear, convincing, converging evidence for the existence of God. Dr. Shook mentions all the different holy books and arcane miracles, says that theologians disagree with each other, none of which, incidentally, has been relevant to my discussion or in any way used by me as evidence for the existence of God. I've never quoted chapter or verse of any holy book, nor have I suggested that that's the reason why we believe that God exists. I pointed to evidence from science, from human reason, the mind, and the heart, and human experience, not simply religious, sort of goosebump feelings. I've talked about the religious intuition that every human being, almost in history, has had. And I'm not suggesting that this is God exists because of popular vote. I'm saying surely this would, for any skeptical, for any inquisitive thinker, look inside and say, why? Why is this religious intuition so powerful? Why is there such clear converging evidence from science and from reason and from human history? Why is it that the Christian is standing there and saying, look at this with your own eyes. Measure this miracle. How is this tilma still around after 400 years? And the one miracle that every Christian does believe in is the miracle of the resurrection, that Christ truly has risen. And yet all of that I've tried to suggest, while important, all of that is just a preamble. That ultimately, being able to say that all religions, and I will fully grant that there has been a huge plethora of religions in history, but the question is it more likely to say that every single one has been entirely wrong, or every single one has been partly right? And the Christian is able to say that every religion, in some sense, inasmuch as it experiences and it points to the transcendent, that it points to the supernature, to a nature beyond this, inasmuch as it does that, is true. And so in the course of this debate, I've tried to show with evidence those 2 points, that it is more reasonable to state that God exists than he doesn't, and a second, to show that the Christian narrative of God is credible and convincing. I think the argument is less like a mathematical problem that must be solved and more like a personal relationship that can begin. As a matchmaker, I've had to provide clear evidence that you should take the plunge and go on a first date. That evidence is widely spread. It's drawn from science and reason and human experience, from human history. There's much more that can be said about each of these areas. I hope we can get into some of them more in the questions. However, my sincerest hope is that the evidence for the likelihood of God's existence is enough to encourage you, at least to take that plunge and to go on that first date, to begin a relationship, not just to come to know that God exists, not just to come to know about God, but to come to know God. A month ago today, Christmas Day, we celebrated something that seems almost too good to be true, that God assumed a human nature, entered human history. It seems too good to be true, but it isn't. And today, we celebrate the conversion of St. Paul, this man, this skeptic, who experienced the Lord's love, not in arguments, but in a direct personal encounter, in a very direct personal place, in all the reality and heart of the human existence, on his road to Damascus. He was a man, he was a human being like you and me, in a real time, in a real place, with his own struggles. And God met him there in a way that his life changed forever. Arguments can only provide a preamble of faith. I admit that. But they can help us see the reasonableness of faith. And they can certainly knock down any apparent barriers to faith, even though they are not faith. Faith comes ultimately from God. And love is nurtured in a life of prayer and holiness. It's the greatest relationship you'll ever have. In faith, we receive our deepest dignity, our purpose and mission in life, a hope in the resurrection, the joy of being children of God, and union with God in this life and in the next. I can only speak for myself personally, that my own life has never been the same since coming to know God. And at one time, I was on the other side of this exchange. It's my sincerest prayer, if you haven't already, that you have the same experience. I ask you to give God a chance. This debate is about the most important question you'll ever ask. To atheists who say, "Are you sure that there is a God?" I say, with all of these clear and convincing arguments, I am. Are you so sure that there isn't? Thank you.
Well, we're on the home stretch, just 5 minutes more. Let me make a few parting responses. You know, Father Griffin complained when I brought up miracle and revelation and unusual experiences. If you'll recall correctly, actually he brought it up first. Although I will say he's wise to ignore the traditions of his church in this matter. I'd put the question to him in this way: which ultimately takes precedence for knowing God, the Bible or your church? The Catholic Church has long claimed that, of course, the church takes precedence because the church alone has decided what the Bible is and how to correctly interpret it. If you don't believe me, ask the Pope. He'll tell you. But, you know, he's left to appeal to intuition. That's what it's come down to. After all these fine words about reason and science, he's left with intuitions. Well, yes, there are such things as religious intuitions. There are lots of different kinds of intuitions. Religious intuitions have led humanity to all sorts of things. Animism, talking trees, fairies in the mountains, polytheism, spiritualism, pantheism, demon worship, shamanism. There's plenty of religious intuition. Doesn't all point to a God. Not anything like the God of Christianity or similar religions. Supernaturalism itself is less than 3,000 years old. That's just a blink in the eye in the history of humanity. Who knows what'll come next? After complaining he wasn't going to talk about Revelation, he talked about Revelation. We heard about resurrections. Can Scripture really be evidence of God? Lots of religions say that their scriptures are approved or written by God. I got to tell you, the Bible is a particularly poor source for any reliable information about God, the Old Testament, the New Testament. No original New Testament texts even exist now. Only shards and segments of some of the books are older than about the 3rd century. It's just wishful thinking that these are somehow accurate transcriptions by reporters on the scene. The disciples, by the way, were illiterate. Furthermore, the oldest complete Bibles, they date from the 5th and 6th centuries. And they actually read differently from each other, not in like minor ways, but like in crucial doctrinal ways, like about what Jesus said and did. They disagree with each other. It's impossible to accurately decide which variations correctly duplicate the lost originals, if indeed there were any. Yeah, the difficulties of translating Aramaic into Greek, Greek into Latin, Latin into English. It's impossible to avoid the judgment that humans and churches have largely decided what the Bible is, and the Jesus myths are just that. When you read the scriptures, they look like just what you'd expect from extinct civilizations. Why didn't the Bible just say, look, the sun doesn't go around the earth goes around the sun? Or why didn't it say, I made lots and lots of other worlds too? Or why didn't it say somewhere, let's have a government where the people get to vote? No, it's not. None of it's in the Bible. The Bible doesn't say anything like those things. People wrote the Bible. People made up all the other holy books too. Father Griffin claimed that God became man. But why not woman, by the way? Just asking. Is this an intuitive claim? I think intuition has more common sense than that. Something both fully human and divine. I warned you about mystery mongering. That sounds like just more mystery mongering to me. In conclusion, Father Griffin didn't succeed in persuading us of his arguments. He pointed to a lot of different evidence. It just never added up. I was able to tear them apart. They don't get where he wants to go, and we're right to continue to doubt. I'm not sure there's a God. I told you I'm a skeptical atheist. I think everyone should be skeptical too. Interestingly enough, I think there's other good things that religion could be put to than worrying over whether God exists and which religion has the right God. And if you've got the wrong name for God, how quickly can I go to war to you? And how quickly can we slit each other's throats over the fight over who's going to get into whose heaven? I think there's a lot more interesting things that people of goodwill, good spirit, and good intelligence can do with their lives, whether you want to call it religious life or spiritual life or secular life. I think we've got a lot bigger problems that we've got to work on together as humanity in a global situation where the planet is rapidly getting out of control and religion is making every problem worse. This is my secular position, and I hope you've at least found it interesting and perhaps slightly plausible. Thank you very much.
All right, well, as I said, we'll go through the questions, but if we could, partially to thank them, but also to give them a brief moment of respite, give them both a round of applause for all they've done. And now, following the same order we've been going tonight, I will start with a question to Father Griffin. And I'm reading these as written and with no edits unless there's, inappropriate things. First part is inappropriate, you know what I mean. First part's not a question. Thank you for taking your time to attend this event. That was them, not me. Do you believe that it is sound academic practice to teach creationism in grade schools?
Well, I would say that creationism, like evolutionism, can mean so many different things. If by creationism is meant a very confining, restricted understanding of those first chapters of Genesis, that there were in fact 7 24-hour days and so forth, I would suggest that it is, particularly if it's done in a way that is purported to be in accord with the ordinary methods of reason and science. That I would say that no, to be sure, that there is a way of reading those first chapters, which is very, very reasonable and very understandable. I mean, it's an understanding that it's religious language, that God is the creator and he created in an orderly way, and that the pinnacle of creation were men and women, and that there was a time in which men and women disobeyed God. And I mean, there's religious language being used to convey real truths, but it's not purporting or attempting or trying to replace a scientific textbook. And I would say that if we tried to take hostage the Bible in order to turn it into something that it was never intended to be, then that's bad education.
Well, I might just briefly respond. I don't believe that creationism should be taught in schools as science. I do think precisely because both creationism and intelligent design are not scientific, either in spirit, hypothesis, or conclusions, it's inappropriate for it to appear in any science class. The study of religions in, let's say, world cultures or social studies classes is an entirely appropriate place to learn about the world's cultures, ethnic heritages, and religions in a respectful way to all religions.
Dr. Shook, how can science explain how the animate came from the inanimate in relation to the origin of the universe?
Not being a biologist, you will get a very inadequate and only 2-minute answer. Of course, if science could never explain the origin of life, that would be a big black mark on science. Would that mean religion is right? No, because again, you're not forced into a different alternative, if that alternative is no better an explanation than the first one. But I doubt that it will remain a mystery. Before the lifetimes are over of many people in the audience, I think there will be a good understanding of how chemistry, under the right catalytic conditions on the early Earth, were capable of producing strings of sugars and proteins that came to be autocatalytic and eventually metabolic once they discovered how to be inside cells. This is sounding very inadequate because I am a humble philosopher, and this is a very sketchy story. But nevertheless, it's premature to say that science can't explain this. It was only your grandfather's and grandmother's times that it was asserted that it could never be explained how life could reproduce. Well, then they promptly figured out DNA and conception and how pregnancy works. Oops, right. So I wouldn't undervalue the capacity of science to explain these things.
I would say that certainly I'm even less a biologist, I suspect, than Dr. Shook. I would say that while I sort of doubt that such a science will ever be discovered, but the point is that whether it is or is not, it certainly can be understood within the context of a theistic point of view, as can evolution itself. You know, we had Dr. Shook mentioned evolution in the course of his remarks. I would simply say that evolution, if anything, perhaps highlights and glorifies the wonder of God's intelligent design, if you will, using that term loosely, in the creation and how he decided to create life. So whether life, animate, came from inanimate or not, it can certainly be understood within the context of a good and wise creator.
All right, Father Griffin, how do you explain the occurrence of accidents that cause damage or death to innocent if an all-knowing, all-powerful God could have prevented them?
In 2 minutes. This is probably the topic that has arrested the attention of theologians, as Dr. Shook has pointed out, for so many centuries. I think it's a really fascinating, it's an important and fascinating and, in a sense, dreadful kind of discussion to have. I would say that, in a very, very brief time that I have, say that ultimately it's rooted in the great risk, if you will, using that term loosely and humanly, the great risk that God made us with freedom, and that our freedom could only be a freedom that ultimately could reject him if we wished. That to say that, well, God could have created a freedom wherein we couldn't reject him is like saying that God could have made a square circle. It's something that it's a non-thing. It's irrational. So if he made us free and he wanted children, not automatons, then we could have denied him. And in some way, as stewards of creation, that when we said no to him, when we disobeyed him, then that whole thing became out of sync in a way that we all kind of see. I mean, it's, as they say, original sin is the one dogma that can be defined by the front page of the New York Times. You look at that thing and you see something is wrong. And that somehow overflowed into the created order as well. And so when, bad things happen to good people or bad things happen to bad people or whatever, the fact is that in some way it is rooted ultimately in that mystery, the great powerful mystery of human freedom. I would also say that, as St. Augustine said, God would only permit evil if he intended to draw a greater good from it. And I think we've seen that sometimes even in the microsphere in our own lives. And I think it's writ large in each of our lives that we'll one day understand.
Just very briefly, because I'd already talked about the problem of evil, human freedom is a great good, but there's lots of natural evils that human freedom doesn't explain. I mean, just the suffering of babies born from terrible genetic defects or diseases. It's not the result of human freedom. Life is a great risk. The evidence is scarce. If there is a God, she couldn't blame us for being skeptical, I think.
Dr. Shook, 3 questions in one with 2 minutes. What gives your life meaning? Why bother to get out of bed in the morning? Why are we all here?
In 2 minutes, right? Yeah.
The last one first, actually many of us are missing. No, I mean, really, if you think about it, God is the greatest abortionist. If there is a God, right, think about it. Many conceptions don't result in fetuses, many fetuses are miscarried, many births don't go well. Evolution, natural evolution, not divinely guided evolution, can explain why being a fetus is one of the most hazardous places on the planet. Being a mother trying to give birth is very hazardous. There are many who aren't here, and if God is using evolution to make us, God likes horror, tragedy, blood, and waste. That's quite a God. As for getting out of bed, coffee usually does it. But that points to a larger question, right? Why coffee? Well, actually, no. Why is there meaning in life? We're fortunate as human beings to have other human beings to guide us with cultures and narratives and stories that give us life meaning. We live for each other. It only takes the perversity of religion to tell us, no, we don't live for each other. We live at the mercy and for the sake of some mysterious authoritarian tyrant. And that's not meaning. That's called being a puppet or being a slave, and I don't intend to be either.
Well, thank you for that beautiful description of everything I don't believe, because I certainly don't consider myself a slave in any way or God a tyrant. I would certainly say that the mystery of suffering and evil is that there is a mysterious dimension to it. You know, I think we have to look that straight in the face. I think everyone has to look that straight in the face. I don't think the atheist has a more reasonable narrative of that great mystery than the Christian. And in fact, on the contrary, I'd say that the Christian understanding is the one narrative that actually gives some meaning. God doesn't cause suffering and evil, but he does hollow it. And he does hollow it with the suffering of and the resurrection of his Son, Jesus Christ.
Father Griffin, why does morality have to be grounded on an absolute standard and not be relative? After all, different religions proffer different standards for morality.
Sorry, did you say, why does it have to be grounded in?
Why does morality have to be grounded on an absolute standard and not be relative?
Okay. Well, I mean, I don't know, I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, why it has to be grounded in absolute. I would say that, you know, without an understanding of an absolute morality, that ultimately there would be exceptions to every moral norm. And I think that that's something, the reason I wanted to bring it up is because I think it's something that is discordant with our own understanding of morality. That we believe that rape is always wrong. Always, simply, everywhere, in every time, in every place, by any person, in any culture. And I think only an absolute norm can provide that kind of grounding, such that we can hold on to it and say, even if, you know, whatever, I could save my family by raping somebody, it is still wrong to rape somebody. And those, when you really cause those extreme circumstances, you know, that ultimately without an absolute standard of morality, then most of us would probably cave and do what we all know deep down is wrong, and wrong always and everywhere. And I think only a belief in God, only an understanding that there's a lawgiver, that there's an order to the universe provided above us and from without us, can provide that kind of confidence.
Well, it's funny how this mysterious God can suddenly be so knowable when it comes to morality. You know, atheists know rape is wrong. Objectively and absolutely everywhere and for all times, for all humanity. Atheists aren't the only ones who know this. People have known this for a very long time, and this gives us confidence. Civilized peoples know that it's wrong. Civilized peoples also believe that they know that it's wrong without having to be told by some authority figure, divine or earthly. The great danger of telling people that authorities decide morality is authorities change. Scriptures change. Popes change. You get people habituated to obeying authorities, and that's how atrocities happen.
Dr. Shook, within the last half century, there have been great advancements in our knowledge of the natural world in the area of physics and string theory. Many of these discoveries, a low entropy universe, multiple precise physical constants, and the Big Bang theory showing the universe comes from a singularity or out of nothing, all point to an extremely small probability of existence and, especially, chance for life. Why do you choose not to believe in God when all this very modern science makes the probability for life and existence much, much lower than the opposite? Does this choice make sense?
Well, that interesting statement has a false premise. As a matter of fact, cosmology, string theory, these sorts of things are actually tentatively telling us that what was responsible for the creation of the Big Bang was some prior existence perfectly capable of creating lots of other universes, perhaps 10 to the 500, which is as close to infinite as the human mind can imagine, or perhaps an actual infinite number of universes and infinite variety. If indeed creation consists of that immense variety of universes, the odds of ending up in a universe like ours actually approach 1. I mean, think about it. Long ago, we were on the only planet that we knew about. How special, how designed for us. We're unique. Lent a lot of support to religion. Now we are finding hundreds, soon thousands of planets of every description and variety around other stars. Only a few of them are going to end up looking anything like ours, much less habitable for life as we know it. But the point is that there are going to end up being millions of near-Earths around our galaxy, and of course trillions of other galaxies. It doesn't look so special anymore. You don't need a designer anymore if you have enough of raw material to begin with. And I expect cosmology is going to tend in that direction. Can it be proven that there are all these other universes? No. Can it be proven that ours, had to happen the way it did? I don't know. But I'm willing to let science take the lead. Interestingly enough, theology would follow. You folks, again, will see within your lifetimes theologies spring up that are perfectly happy to follow science's lead and describe a God that created an infinite number of other universes. You didn't read that in your Bible, did you?
Well, I mean, I would say that it's true that certainly theology is going to take seriously the findings of science. That doesn't mean that therefore the theology is changing its understanding of God. The question becomes, how can we come to a deeper and deeper understanding of who this God is? I would suggest that as science continues to make progress in understanding the beauty and wonders of our universe, then in fact all that does is inspire believers even more to praise the wisdom of such a creator. That's not changing theology in order to fit scientific facts. It's actually using science to do something which is very beautiful, which is to praise God even more deeply.
Father Griffin, Immanuel Kant based his metaphysics of the idea of the filter of the mind. He stated that the structure of our mind denied us of the ability to know things like our beginning and the outside of the universe. We are conditioned to not know. How do you respond?
Well, I mean, to get into Kant's epistemology is probably a little much. But I mean, I would say that certainly that our minds, there are structures in our minds in some sense, and the question is, what do those structures suggest? What do they suggest about how our minds are made and what our minds can know? And in some sense, that's kind of been part of the point of this discussion this evening, is to sort of say, what can in fact our minds know? And what can they not know? What is beyond the confines of reason? What is beyond the confines of science? What is beyond the confines even of human experience? And so I think maybe at a deeper level, taking the question to the point of view of, what do our minds tell us? And I think our minds tell us something both about the nature of how the minds are made, namely that they are, we sometimes say that God is a projection of us. In fact, I think it's the other way around, that we're a projection of God, that we're made in his image and likeness. And so therefore those structures of reason, whatever they may be, in some way reflect the reasonableness of our Creator, the personhood of our Creator. And I think also what our minds can know is pointing, as we've tried to suggest in the course of this debate, incessantly and really inexorably to the existence of God.
I would just briefly say that from the naturalistic perspective, we should humbly recognize the limitations of human intelligence. If there is a God or God's trying to talk to us, still has to be in some communicable form amenable to our human minds, such as it is. And such as it is, you have to admit that the human mind is responding, if there is any such communication, with thousands of religions. I think that says a great deal about the human mind. I don't think it says anything about God.
Dr. Shook, there are many common threads in religions all over the world, including the do unto others as you would have them do unto you that you mentioned. Where did they all get this idea from, as the same lesson wouldn't be made up by many, but come from one source?
Yeah, that source was evolution. The project of moral naturalism is, not been around for very long, hardly longer than Darwin's theory of evolution itself. It turns out that if you study basic common morality, those basic virtues and duties we all teach to little kids, and you take a sampling of every human society today, and it's probably true of past ones, Homo sapiens teaches little kids these common moral virtues and rules in basically the same way, which tells us that this is very old stuff. This is probably going back as old as the Homo sapiens species has been around. There might even have been similar things used by earlier hominid ancestors. We can't be sure, but morality is intensely useful, as it turns out, for maintaining good relations within large social groups of highly social creatures like us. Now, religions are much younger. Maybe at most, because of course religions rely on fairly sophisticated conceptions. You require language in order to tell stories, narrate them, teach them to the young, get them to be passed on as belief systems. Religions probably aren't older than about 40 or 50,000 years old. Far, far younger than morality. And indeed, we do find the case that religion may be designed to try to reinforce that morality, but it did not invent that morality. And what that means is religions get into deep trouble, and you hardly ever see this, when religions try to override or contradict that basic morality. That's a good thing, at least. Religions mess with morality in other ways, but no religion has succeeded very long in violating that common morality. Religions indeed elevate much of that common morality into high idealistic principle. I don't have a major objection to this. I just think this is human intelligence at work, not any God, and I think seculars should be part of that project.
I think the difficulty, well, first of all, I certainly agree that religion did not invent morality, but I think that's kind of the point, is that morality is something that is rooted in the way that we are made. There's something rooted in our human nature. We call it the natural law. The point about herd instinct and evolutionary sources of morality is the difficulty with it really is that it, I think, conflates instinct with the use of instinct or the moral norms. C.S. Lewis said that instincts are like the notes on a piano, and sheet music is the moral law. That we can't, because sometimes there are weaker instincts, such as helping the other, that we choose in place of stronger instincts, like the self-preservation instinct. My only point is that I don't even say that there can be no relationship between evolution and morality. I mean, I think that the way God made us, and if the theory of evolution is correct, then there's no reason why we couldn't have been given this human nature such that we would learn more and more over time how to get along with each other. So I'm not even suggesting that there's no relationship whatsoever. But I do think that it's important to suggest that, first of all, religion didn't invent morality. On the contrary, religion is something that points to morality that is already rooted in our own souls, in our natures, and the conscience that would judge that.
Father Griffin, how do you argue that God is not simply a convenient evolutionary construct to explain the unexplained, similar to love as a useful evolutionary construct?
Well, I think it's I mean, that's kind of the point of the debate. Why is this not a delusion? Why is this not just sort of a projection of what we want to be? Why is it just like it would be more convenient, it would be more useful, it would be more friendly to imagine a universe in which God exists? And I think we have to look at hard evidence. We have to look at what science is telling us, what the cosmological arguments are telling us, what the argument from design and beauty is telling us, or from human experience, and look at creativity. I mean, we're looking at real things. We're not looking at, gee, wouldn't it be nice if there were such a thing as God? And even if there weren't, I think we're going to go ahead and believe him anyway because it kind of keeps everybody in line, right? I mean, if that were the argument, I'd be the first one to throw the thing overboard, right? I'm saying that there are really good, serious reasons, scientifically, reasonably, experientially, and historically, for believing that God exists, and also for believing that the Christian narrative of God is extremely compelling and credible.
All right, Dr. Shook, if God does not exist, why is human life important? Is it because it's useful, or is it inherently important? If it's inherently important, why? What makes it so?
It's inherently important because it's ours. Humanity is not mistaken that it's important. Not so important that we are entitled to destroy or have dominion over the rest of the planet, despite what you might read in some scriptures. We know better now. But it's a really, really cold, empty universe out there. We'd better take care of each other. For now, we're all we got. We may meet and communicate with alien civilizations. Maybe we may receive transmissions that were announced long ago by civilizations because of time and space and distance that may have met their demise before we can ever return the greeting with a hi, what's up? But for now, it's us, and we have got to take care of each other. Now, many religions have evolved to the point where they do respect the value of all humanity. Secularists like myself do not disagree. This is a noble message, and it would be perverse to abandon it. But again, we don't need a religion to tell us. I'm surprised I agree, but we've heard it said, religion did not make morality. I think many Bible readers would be surprised to hear that, but nevertheless, there it is. If humanity made morality, then we're responsible for conducting ourselves in as humane a way as possible. And I think this is noble effort for religious-minded people and secular-minded people to work together and not against each other.
Just a clarification, by saying that religion didn't make morality, I didn't mean that humans therefore made morality. My point is that our human nature was made such that morality is something that was understood. It's something bigger than us, and it's something bigger than our evolutionary instincts.
Father Griffin, how do you explain the plethora of religions, mono and polytheistic alike, if humans are imbued with God?
Well, I'd say that there's an order of the plan of salvation that God has revealed to humanity. And while all of those religions in some way point to the transcendent and sort of express the yearnings in the human heart for the divine, clearly they are mutually incompatible. And I'm the first to admit that, first to say that. The point is that I think all of them express something that is true. And to suggest that all of them express nothing that is true is a far more strident claim. I think that God works after the original sin, after that original fall, that I think we sort of all see written into our own natures, into the conflict that's in our own heart, into the conflict between human beings, and the natural disasters and accidents, and all the rest of the ways that we can see that something is wrong with the universe, that God enters into that in the radical brokenness that we all experience, and begins slowly over time to work through that and to become, ultimately to become one of us, right in the thick of it, right in the messiness of all the human condition. I think without the revelation of Jesus Christ, without the fact that God became a man, and ultimately in an incredible act, in an infinite act of love, died for our salvation, I think it's much more difficult to sort of understand, did God have a plan to begin with? And the fact is that he did. And he began that plan right at the fall, right at the beginning. And he set in motion a plan that ultimately would lead to our salvation.
So let's get this straight. God made a broken universe full of broken people. What a God. Would you buy a watch from this guy? I think it eloquently speaks to the way that certain religions have made themselves appear to be absolutely necessary and useful. If you're sure you're so sick, the cure will look awfully good. Should you be sure that you're so sick? Human beings have their problems, but are you trusting the doctor?
There are 4 on this one, but with time I'm going to have to pick one for you, Dr. Shook. Isn't the premise of neutrality false? Is there any real thing such as neutrality?
By neutrality, I simply meant setting up some sort of reasonable ground where people can actually conduct a debate. Out there in the messy world, there's very little neutrality. I mean, we live in Washington, D.C. Come on, right? But in academic settings like this, when people have goodwill and with some time on their hands to do the best they can with what they've got, the principle of neutrality simply says if you're going to try to make a reasoned decision between 2 choices, don't rely on some premises to argue for your position that people only holding that position hold. It was just not fair. It's a form of begging the question, and that's a formal logical fallacy, and I'm not going to preach logic to folks, but it is common sense that you shouldn't beg the question against the other side. And I'm glad to say we hardly heard any of that. Poor evidence, perhaps, but not a lot of begging the question. So really, that's all I meant by the principle of neutrality.
Yeah, I would agree. We did hear a lot of poor evidence tonight. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
We could blame the scientists for the inadequate evidence.
Father Griffin, in 2 minutes, how was God originally created?
Well, that's a lot less than 2 minutes. He wasn't. That's the point. He's the uncaused cause. And there has to be, ultimately, metaphysically, an uncaused cause. If all being is contingent and ultimately stretched over time, there would be a moment, as St. Thomas himself said 1,000 years ago almost, that there would be a time in which nothing would be, nothing would exist, and therefore nothing would exist now. And so there has to be, at the ground of contingency, some necessary being, and that necessary being is God. And that is precisely, in a sense, the definition, the philosophical definition from that point of view of God, that he's the uncaused cause.
Well, going from evidence to metaphysics is quite a leap. We're at the very stretches and reaches of the rational imagination. There could be an uncaused cause, he says, but that, for all we know, it could turn out to just be capital N nature, that infinite, endless, perhaps quantum megaverse of all the universes that has ever existed and will ever exist. Not our own universe. It looks like a little bubble that will come to be and perhaps expand together forever or collapse. Is that an uncaused cause? Metaphysical quibbles quickly ensue. What we do know is that the supernaturalist really hates it when anything natural is infinite or endless. My skeptical point simply is he can't prove it doesn't exist. He can't prove otherwise. And to claim that only God gets to be the endless uncaused cause thing is just simply begging the question. Pantheism might be an option. If you want to worship order and all that really exists, worship nature if you find that satisfying, but don't call it, a religion, much less Christianity.
Dr. Shuck, can an atheist humanist view of life actually give greater clarity and explanation to the question of why?
There is actually only one interesting answer to the question of why. Why not? Go out there, live life, experiment. Take this opportunity that we have as far as we can take it with all the resources at our disposal, and don't let anybody ever tell you otherwise. That's a humanist message. We have to live our lives together. If you need a larger answer to the question of why, atheism, naturalism cannot give it to you because we don't think that life exists for the sake of something else that's not life, not even a God. Again, that would make us mere tools or puppets. We might have to be grateful, but we could never actually really respect it. I think that the answer to why has to be answered by each one of us through our own creative freedom ourselves. And if we answer it in different ways, so be it. But I think we do have the responsibility to exercise our own creative freedom to create our own meanings in this life. And that's simply the best that we can do with this life.
I was going to not add a response until Dr. Shuck just mentioned that at the very end, create our own meanings. I think there's some truth to that. Certainly we need to take seriously our own lives and our own freedom. But I think that it's a far less satisfying and intellectually, frankly, less likely reality, that we sort of feel our lives are going in a direction, that they've been given a direction, that we have a mission and a purpose to fulfill, and that we're made in order to fulfill that destiny. That sense of destination is something that can only come from without us, because otherwise it's just simply more delusion. It's just a delusion that we impose upon ourselves instead of a delusion supposedly given to us by our religion. So I think it's important that we realize that there is meaning in our lives, but that meaning ultimately has to be grounded in something bigger than us.
Father Griffin, Francis Collins, a Christian and the man who sequenced the genome, says that humans in our evolved form now have existed for 100,000 years. If this is true, why did God wait for 98,000 years before revealing himself as Jesus in the Middle East?
Yes. I don't know. We should ask him when we get there. I don't know. I mean, I think there is, to some extent, when we're speaking about the decisions, so to speak, that God makes, we're speaking about one who is infinitely beyond ourselves. We have clues into his existence. We are given clues through, again, science and reason about who he is. Ultimately, we have to depend upon revelation to know much about him. I deliberately didn't quote scripture and verse, in the course of this debate, because the debate was asking a broader question: does God exist? I hinted at some reasons why I believe that the Christian understanding of God is most credible. But that's, the point is that once we get beyond the fact that God exists, if we believe that no effect can exceed its cause, then it's more likely than not that God is not only reasonable but personal. And if he's a person in some sense, then isn't it likely that he would want to reveal himself to us? And so the idea of revelation, I'm just talking about the idea of revelation, once we concede the existence of God, is very likely. And then the question becomes, if there is revelation, which one is most credible? And so if we say that, that there's revelation, that God has spoken to us, and we can say that this is what we know about God, but to question his motives or to question why he did this and not this, and why he created this kind of universe and not that kind of universe, I freely admit is something beyond my or anyone else's ken.
Interesting point about revelation. I mean, in order to classify an unusual experience as a revelation, you already have to presume that there's a God existing to do the revealing to you. And I understand many religious people do that in a wide variety of ways. But as a logical point, it's, again, begging the question. Revelation cannot, by definition, be used as proper evidence for a God, because you already have to assume that there's a God in order for it to be categorized as revelation. You're arguing in circles.
Dr. Shook, there's two questions here. Have you heard of Professor Brian Cox, a British physicist? What would you make of his theory that life is only possible in our universe as it is constructed now, from order to chaos, heat to absolute zero, and nothing for the rest of eternity?
Oh, yes, that's right. And others have pointed this out too. It turns out that the sweet spot in the course of the evolution of a universe like ours is after there have been enough evolution of stars, they explode, they produce rich minerals. Only science, by the way, could tell you this. No religion would ever do it. That most of you may not have even known. We're made of explosions of supernovas. Only some of the hydrogen and a tiny bit of helium in your bodies is original from the Big Bang. Everything else, all the silicon and magnesium and oxygen and potassium and so forth that we're made of, came out of supernova explosions of dead stars. So you need a certain number of billion years for this to happen in galactic formation in order for there to be rocky, rich, metal-rich planets like ours, and then you can get life going. If the universe continues to accelerate its expansion, as the evidence now suggests, that sweet spot where there are going to be metallic Earths near nice stars like ours isn't going to last for maybe a few dozen more billion years at the most. And then the big rip happens. Things get so far apart that actually galaxies fall apart, planetary systems fall apart, and there's just not enough warmth anymore to sustain life. So there's this sort of sweet spot where you would expect to find life. Science tells us that, by the way.
We will do one final question that was listed as for both of you. So, and since you've both answered 8 questions, this sounds like a good one to end on. Which is nobler, and we'll start with Father Griffin, which is nobler, to do the right thing simply because you think it is the right thing to do, or because you hope to be rewarded after you die? If you think the former, then why does belief in any God matter?
I would say that, in a sense, they're both the same thing. To do something because it's the right thing to do is the beginning of eternal life on earth. I mean, it's something that this is how we, in fact, begin to fulfill ourselves, is by living the sort of life that we were intended to live. And that's what ultimate maturity is. And at death, we believe, is simply, death itself is a process from life into life. And that it's the completion, it's the integration, it's the final maturity of the person. It's the fullness of life. And therefore, doing something because it's the right thing to do is doing something because we want to be completely who we're intended to be, which is to be saints in heaven.
Well, I'd agree with the saint part. We should aspire to be saints. We will all fall short, secular saints no less than religious saints. I think that it is a sign indeed of maturity that we take responsibility for being moral and doing the right thing precisely because we know it is the right thing to do and we stand on that authority. We don't appeal to some other authority, be it a religion or a scripture or a revelation or a pope. And if humanity were to actually reach that full maturity, when billions and billions and billions of people on this planet have lived and died and are living today, clouded and disoriented and not free because they are under the yoke of some religion or another, if we could get past that, what a truly admirable and noble life that could be for humanity.
And with that, I will invite Cara Dunford back up on the stage to wrap us up.
I ask you guys to join me in just giving a round of applause for our 2 debaters, Father Griffin and Dr. Shook. I'd also like to thank our moderator, Tim Miller, for being so generous with his time this evening. To the Center for Inquiry, especially Melody Hensley, for partnering with us on this event, and also to Bill Goodwin for filming it. And for their assistance in facilitating this event and help making it a reality, Ted Costigan, Hugo Schechner, and the GW Student Association, the Marvin Center event staff, and the University Police Department. And finally, we'd just like to thank you all for coming tonight and for your thoughtful questions. I think that you'll agree that this was an enjoyable discussion and some good points presented on both sides. So we hope you had a good time and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.